Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll make a start, but welcome. It's great to have you with us. Sorry we're keeping you up and that it's going to be late when you finally get to bed tonight, but we really appreciate you joining us. So thank you so much for that. And anybody who's joining via the live stream, welcome to you as well. If you have any questions on the presentation, please email them to Steve Wright. That's swright@nazarene.ac.uk, and he will ask them on your behalf. Okay, so welcome to Mandy, who's here for the first time, so it's really good to have you with us. And we'll hand over to you for your presentation. If there's time for some questions and things at the end, that would be great. But otherwise, we look forward to your presentation, so thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. This might sound terrible to you, but the outbreak of coronavirus and public reaction to it creates perfect background for my presentation on purity. And particularly because the modern people tend to kind of treat ancient fears of impurity, its power and pollution as kind of a primitive superstition. And suddenly, we experience similar anxiety about spread of the virus, its contagiousness. We employ similar language, similar tactics, state-sanctioned separation, abstention, exclusion, and of course, purification. And suddenly, we want to be friends with the Pharisees, because the Pharisees were washing their hands and bathing regularly. And we are, it seems to me that we are not that really different from ancients after all. But let me get straight to the topic of my presentation. So this afternoon for you and this wonderful Melbourne night for me, we'll be talking about purity in Greco-Roman religious tradition and the Gospels, mapping the landscape. So, he starts every morning with ritual washing of hands and sprinkling his body with purification water. To protect himself from impurity throughout the day, he chews laurel leaf. He regularly purifies his house. To avoid pollution, he refuses to look at tombstones, dreads any contact with a dead body or a woman who has recently given birth. He treats epileptics and people with mental illnesses as unclean. He regularly seeks counsel from the exegetes of the sacred laws, the official advisors on the problems of pollution and purification. Once a month, he participates in purification rites of Orphic mysteries and repeatedly cleanses himself with sea water. If he catches a glimpse of a person eating garlic, he undergoes ablutions and summons priests to perform blood purification by circling him with blood running from a sacrificed puppy. This description comes to us from Theophrastus, an ancient Greek philosopher and a scientist. As a keen observer of daily life in Athens, he notes different types of men around him. There is the flatterer, there is the chatterbox, the unsophisticated countryman, the shameless man, the stingy one, the dull one, the gossiper, and the oligarch. He mentions 30 peculiar personalities in total. This gives his book a title, Characters. Oh yeah, they are characters indeed. Among them, the philosopher notes a man who is obsessed with ritual purity. His whole life is dedicated to avoiding impurity at any means. In his quest for ritual cleanliness, he goes beyond of what is expected from a good Athenian citizen. He lives and often behaves like a priest. Theophrastus calls this man and others like him Daimon, a God-fearer. But there is a twist. The whole scene is a satire. The philosopher mocks this unreasonable obsession with purity, ridicules this way of living, and demonstrates by means of exaggeration and irony the absurdity of such behavior. Well, Theophrastus is a pretentious name given to this philosopher by Aristotle himself, allegedly in recognition of divine eloquence. Here, Theophrastus, divine expression, comments on excesses of religion observance and sets a subversive tradition that makes this kind of obsessive piety and religious zealotry synonymous with superstition and compulsive irrationality. Some uncanny similarities could not escape an attentive reader of the Gospels. Obsession with ritual impurity and zealousness over the sacred laws of Moses mark out the Pharisees, a Jewish purity sect. Their relentless pursuit of purity guided all aspects of their individual and communal living. Levitical purity laws and Mosaic regulations for priests had been extended into the lives of common people. Regular washing of hands, ritual immersions, purifications of furniture and utensils, avoidance of all things and people unclean, and eating kosher food were everyday occurrences in the life of a Pharisee and his family. Now, Jesus, the divine word, demonstrates absurdity of their religious practices through ironic remarks and clever parables, castigates excesses of purity observance in his speeches, and subverts their approach to impurity by crossing forbidden boundaries. But for Jesus, it's not about rational behavior of a responsible citizen and living out Delphic maxima, nothing in excess, in the matters of religion. Standing with the bounds of the prophetic tradition, Jesus is calling to set priorities right, as the kingdom of God is breaking into this world and pushes uncleanliness away. Pharisaic anxiety over impurity not only clouds the original intentions of the sacred law, but also shrouds things of greater importance: justice, mercy, and love. Their purity preoccupation burdens rather than sets the people of God free. Thus, in Jesus' teaching, a Pharisee turns from a paragon of purity and righteousness into a synonym for hypocrisy. Let's return to characters for a moment and put Theophrastus' philosophical snobbery aside and go beyond his authorial intentions of moralizing through derision and caricaturing about responsible, reasonable, and socially accepted behavior. Behind this comedy scene and elitist laughs, there is a window opening into the world of common people's religious beliefs and practices that were often driven by fear of the gods and damaging power of impurity. This brief sketch of one day in the life of the Daimon reveals few important things about ritual purity in Greek religious traditions. First, behind practices and attitudes lies a belief in the contagious nature of miasma, or impurity, that one might contract by coming in contact with unclean things and people. Second, purity concerns might go beyond sacred presence of temples and regulations for priests and priestesses, and spill out into the everyday lives of ancient Greeks. Third, There are sects within Greek religious tradition that pursue purity as a way of living. Fourth, there are religious professionals who specialize in interpretation of purity laws and performing purification rites. Fifth, some sources of uncleanness are identified: a corpse, childbirth, unclean people, and unclean food. Sixth, clean and impure spaces have been mentioned in passing: a house, a cemetery. Seventh, there are different means of purification: washing hands, ablutions, or sprinkling with lustrial water, immersions in the sea, purification sacrifices, and use of cathartic plants, laurel and squill, and of course including abstention from the sources of miasma. Theophrastus' skit is a peek into a vibrant world where purity concerns are very much alive and driven by sense of danger, fear, disgust, as well as respect for the gods. It is woven into the fabric of ancient society's life through unspoken assumptions, superstitious practices, acts of religious worship, medicine, and even state legislation. In that world, the Greeks appear to be no less concerned about purity as the Second Temple Jews. But according to Herodotus, no one among the ancients could surpass Egyptian obsession with purity. Seeming similarities between Theophrastus' characters and the world of the Gospels are not coincidental. The notion of sacredness and cleanliness had a universal character in the ancient world and had been shared by different religious traditions around the Mediterranean basin and beyond. In fact, the Gospel writers assume that shared experience when they tell purity stories and educate their audience on the peculiarities of Jewish practices. This commonality of experience, but also differences that for both Greeks and Jews amount to nothing less than pure sacrilege, set a backdrop for this project. And this presentation will explore this common yet diverse purity background of Greco-Roman purity traditions and map it against some of the Gospel stories. Well, originally I wanted to talk about how we deal with the sources, what are the historical sources, but if we had a couple of hours, there would be different stories. But unfortunately, I had to cut out some of the stuff, particularly some of the sources stuff. But let's see how we go and what we can discuss. So now let's have a look at some of the aspects of ancient life and purity concerns. And the first one is called sex, birth, and death. For some reason, the ancient gods were quite prudish about the key aspects of human life cycle, and Yahweh was not an exception. Giving birth, touching a corpse, or having sex with a partner or someone's partner rendered humans unclean and unfit for temple worship. This unclean circle of human life is clearly reflected in the majority of temple purity regulation, also known as sacred laws. An inscription from the sanctuary of Athena at Pergamum reads, and I quote, "People who enter the temple of the goddess shall be pure, having washed themselves clean from their own wife or their own husband for 1 day, or from another woman or another man for 2 days. Similarly, from a corpse or from a woman in labor for 2 days." This impure triad of sex, birth, and death often appears in the sources together. The logic behind those prohibitions is unclear. What is clear, that the human body, in one way or another, is perceived as a source of impurity that is incompatible with divine. God's aversion to uncleanliness of that kind spills out into the regulations for priests and priestesses. They also must be free from taint of birth and death. They cannot enter the house of death or the house of birth. They must abstain from sex before attending to the priestly duties. While our God-fearer couldn't look at tombstones, the inhabitants of the island of Delos adopted a more radical approach to the pursuit of purity. Births and deaths were forbidden on the island. Did we just stumble on the Greek notion of Holy Land? Question mark. Some in Greek society saw those divine attitudes and purity regulation as hypocritical, irrational, and superstitious. Iphigenia, a character from Euripides' play, says, and I quote, "I blame the goddess's logic," and she refers to Artemis. "Whichever mortal has engaged in murder, or has touched a woman in childbirth or a corpse, she drives him from her altars, thinking him impure. But she herself delights in human sacrifices." End of quote. According to Pindar, Apollo, the god of purity, exposed himself to the worst pollution by snatching a newborn baby from a burning corpse of a mother. The views on purity were riddled with practical and theological inconsistencies, extreme attitudes and customs that philosophers exposed, comedians ridiculed, politicians used, religious charlatans abused, and the common people followed. Let's talk about sex for a moment. Abstention from sex is a widespread prerequisite for participation in worship, rituals, or religious festivals. During a 9-day celebration of Ceralia, a Roman April fertility festival, matrons were required to abstain from their husbands. So as Greek women during the festival of Thesmophoria. Initiates into Bacchic mysteries were required to abstain from sex for 10 days before fully joining the cult. For Aristotle, an ideal priest or priestess are elderly, who pass their sexual prime and by the virtue of their age are necessarily pure. Despite strict regulations, sexual adventures did happen during religious festivals, and some of them might have encouraged that behavior by giving a license for drinking, debauchery, and indecency, like Roman celebration of Florealia. For some reason, I'm reminded of the rumors about sexual adventures during the holiness rallies and open-air meetings of early Methodists. But anyway, we share some common ground. But Greek and Roman sources are full of scandalous stories that involve sex, purity, and religion. For example, in the 2nd century BCE, Rome was rocked by the suppression of the infamous cult of Bacchus on the allegation that their drunken orgies generate unimaginable pollution from mixing sexual intercourse with religious rituals and invocation of the divine. Sexual purity was also important in the context of everyday life. Lucius Columella, in his work on agriculture, De Re Rustica, notes that cooks, bakers, and those who serve food should abstain from sex or purify themselves before returning to their duties. Moreover, planting and harvesting of olives or beekeeping supposed to be done by children or those who were sexually pure. So NTC, I remember NTC got some beehives, so that's an interesting rule to follow. Okay, keep in mind. Some positions within the Roman society were associated with semi-permanent states of sexual purity or sexual uncleanliness. Virgin priestesses were given responsibility to keep the sacred fire of Vesta burning thus ensuring safety and prosperity of the eternal city. Their virginity, that ideally lasted for 30 years, an overall state of purity allowed them to perform religious rites associated with purification and cleansing. Loss of their virginity was one of the most serious religious offenses in Rome, and seducing a Vestal Virgin, the gravest sexual pollution. In the same time, lasting sexual uncleanliness was associated with prostitutes. Romans believed that their presence could jeopardize purity of other people and places. Seneca notes, and I quote, "Priestesses might be accompanied by a lector to clear a path and ensure they do not come into contact with prostitutes or others who were considered impure." End of quote. Even innocent kissing and sharing a meal in a brothel could transmit sexual impurity. There are few instances in the gospel story where sexual purity serves as a direct background. Both Matthew and Luke highlight Mary's virginity, well, for different apologetic purposes, of course, and the third evangelist is particularly preoccupied with that issue, with Mary's virginity. What is striking in their description is the combination of sexual purity and divine presence that makes perfect sense to Greeks and Romans, as well as the idea of being impregnated by a god. Jesus' interactions with prostitutes and instances of him being touched by them have the issue of sexual purity written all over, as well as the story of a woman caught in adultery. Of course, the story of Jesus curing genital bleeding in Mark 5 will be also seen as an instance of extreme pollutions by the Greeks and Romans. Okay, let's move to impurity of birth. Censorius, a Roman writer, notes that, and I quote, "For the first 40 days of pregnancy and for 40 days after birth, women were expected to avoid sacred spaces." The end of quote. Though they were allowed to enter temples after the first 40 days of pregnancy to pray for safe delivery. In Greek tradition, a new mother pollutes the house and those who enter this house. And those who had a connection with her remain unclean for 3 days. A priest must avoid house of birth for 3 days. Of course, after a certain period of time, purification of the house of birth was taking place, and was included ritual sweeping of the threshold and doors, and also doors and thresholds were decorated with full-grown laurel, which is, of course, was used for purification. According to Festus, children in Rome were purified as well. So he says, "Lustrici" referred to those days, the 8 for girls and the 9 for boys, on which the children are purified and assigned their names. I'm not going to go in more detail about impurity of birth just because we don't have a lot of time, but there's plenty of interesting things. But when you think about the gospel stories, of course, birth and purity is behind Lucan's scene of Jesus' purification in chapter 2, verse 22. And this is the only ritual purification Jesus undergoes through in the context of temple worship. Of course, we can talk about John's baptism, what is that about? But in terms of temple worship and requirements for purifying birth and cleanliness, that's taking place, and Luke is quite open about that. Though, of course, the manuscripts have interesting reading there. So one of the manuscripts says that the time came for his purification, but majority of manuscripts have the time came for their purification, which is quite an interesting change. Is this change to soften the need for purification for Jesus, who is the Son of God, or to clarify that both of them, the new mother and the child, have to be purified. Luke also betrays that his audience there. He says that they need to be purified in accordance with the law of Moses. Of course, assuming that the readers have a Gentile audience there, explaining that these rites are taking place not according to sacred laws of other religions, but according to Jewish sacred laws. But of course, this is a very striking scene, I suppose, because when we look further in the Gospels, we don't see Jesus being purified as he visits the temple, or does purifications on kind of as an everyday occurrence. It's actually the opposite. So the birth purification needs further reflection. And it does make sense for Greeks and Romans, as well as Jews. Also, the stories of blessing of children by Jesus might have purity connotations as well. We don't know what kind of children, but it's suggesting that there is a very small children, perhaps newborns. And if that's the case, then Jesus' prayer or Jesus' blessing is a protective blessing against impurity and its effects, perhaps. Okay, let's move on to impurity of death. Okay. I will omit impurity related to the house of death or to the natural death and causes of the natural death, because there's a lot of material, there's a lot of interesting material and particular rituals connected with dealing with body, and then cleansing of the house, and then cleansing those people who were in contact with the body. But we just don't have time that. But just to note that it seems that the Greeks and Romans treated washing of the body and anointing of the body as removing death, impurity from the body. But of course, the ultimate purification, as one of the Roman writers knows, is taking place in earth. It's the earth, it's the goddess earth that ultimately purifies the body. Okay, I'll skip on that and go to some other matters of impurity that could be interesting for reading the Gospels. Though, of course, the house of death is important as well, because Jesus visits a house of death on a few occasions in Synoptic Gospels, and of course in John. So death impurity that comes from natural death is quite important there. But also, okay, I just don't have time. There's too much stuff. Let's talk about the coarse impurity that comes particularly builds around an anxiety in cases of unattended body. An unburied, unnoticed corpse is a source of dangerous pollution that could affect the whole of community or the whole polis. If a body found, one has to make sure that a token of burial performed. It is an obligation of every good citizen. Impurity from unburied body could also be spread by animals like birds and dogs who would eat corpses. Sophocles in the Antigone describes a nightmarish scenario. The birds of prey dropped scraps of the corpse on the altars, dosed the sacrificial fires, and doomed the whole city. This apocalypse that's caused by pollution. And so this unattended body and burial is quite important. So, for example, consider the parable of the Good Samaritan, with priests avoiding a possible corpse, because the parable says he was half dead, he appeared like a dead. And so the priests, of course, it makes sense for the Greek readers that they need to avoid the body, but also as a good priests, they would have to find somebody, some good citizen that could take care of that body. So there is a conundrum for them. But the parable of Good Samaritan makes perfect sense in the context of Greek anxiety and Greco-Roman anxiety about unattended body. Another issue is connected with suicide. And suicide by hanging was treated as extremely polluting as well. Even the rope and the branch were destroyed or thrown outside of the boundaries of the city. Well, of course, straight away, as the gospel readers, we note impurity connotation in the story of Judas' suicide. But there is a story about Dionysius, the cynic philosopher, who, there's a quote from the story, who was gathering figs. Okay, interesting, gathering figs, okay. And was told by the keeper that not long before a man hanged himself on that very fig tree. Then said Dionysius, I will now purge it, and continued picking up the figs. Well, one can easily imagine Jesus doing something like that, since Jesus also liked figs and fig trees. I'm not sure if fig trees appreciated Jesus' attention, but anyway, that's another story. Another thing that was quite important for Greeks is that the Greeks treated murder pollution as extremely dangerous and compared its effects to sacrilege. A murderer is not only polluted by victim's blood on his hands, but also by the anger of the victim or of avenging spirits acting on his behalf. The rites of purification not only required washing off the blood, but also appeasement of the deceased. In this light, Matthean description of the crowd at Jesus' trial and their acclamation that his blood is on us and our children screams out murder, impurity, and catastrophic effects it brings on the whole of community. For Greeks and Romans, this is so obvious. And of course, then destruction of Jerusalem could have been perceived by Gentile readers as the act of vengeance carried out by God on behalf of Jesus, the victim of unjust murder. While the people were inviting impurity of themselves, noticed Pilate, the Roman, was washing off his hands, cleansing himself of that murder impurity. Another interesting aspect related to death is the idea of scapegoating. In the time when all of community affected by misfortune such as plague or a drought, one of ways of communal purification and appeasing of the gods is to succumb to scapegoating. The oracle of Delphi urges a plague-stricken city to seek out the impious one, to seek that person. And of course, then the guilty and impure person gets expelled or even killed. That's how purification took place. The other way is to sacrifice an innocent and a pure victim. Often, for some reason, that should be a virgin maiden or a clean boy of some sort. So, but this pure victim who dies for the benefit of others, his sacrifice or her sacrifice bring purification. Roman military tradition of devotio adds to the notion of blood pollution and scapegoating new overtones. In the time of imminent defeat, at the orders of a pontiff or a priest, a Roman general becomes a sacer. If you translate it, is he becomes holy. But in a very strange way, he becomes a dangerous object and must willingly throw himself into the enemy ranks to be killed. And there is a twist. The point of this self-sacrifice and expiation that the enemy troops, by spilling his blood, will become unclean, and thus turning anger of the gods away from Romans and on their enemies. So there is a sacred general who brings pollution on the enemies. Very interesting. Anyway, the story of Jesus' crucifixion is ridden with issues of death and purity for Greek and Roman readers. The place of execution outside of the holy city walls cries impurity. He dies surrounded supposedly by murderers who are unclean. And of course, then the way Jesus' body was handled by Joseph of Arimathea and women with the intention to anoint it on the next day, well, of course, that would be perceived as the part of purification process for the body. On the other hand, Jesus' death for many and its purification effects for the people will be quite evident to Greek and Roman readers. And of course, Jesus also faces death and purity in his ministry by visiting a house of death or a graveyard. The resurrection of Lazarus or the saints at the hour of Jesus' death in the Gospel of Matthew will also have impurity connotations. Okay, let us move to, how much time do I have? Another 20 minutes or so. Okay, I think I'll manage. Healing. Popular Greek beliefs connected sickness and impurity, and different schools of Greek medicine would include elements of purification. But one of the most popular approaches among common people is solidly built on ritual purification. People would often turn to so-called purifiers, who remained popular from archaic times and even were known to the church fathers. They would use a repertoire of purification techniques to tackle physical illnesses. Sprinkle of purification water with branch of laurel leaf, fire, fumigation with sulfur, washing, that were often enforced by incantations and abstention from unclean foods. They perceived disease as something that could be purified and washed away. Disease is uncleanliness. And certain skin diseases like leprosy were popularly seen as pollutions. Some tried to cure even impotency by purification as well. To describe healing and purification, some texts evoke the image of Asclepius, god of healings, who stretches his hand and wipes away the disease and cleanses the disease with the touch of his hand. But the methods of purifiers were questioned by educated elite, and purifiers themselves were treated as frauds who do not have any useful remedy to apply. One of those sharp critiques is found in the medical tractate of Hippocratic School of Medicine called On the Sacred Disease, on the Holy Disease. Purifiers came under fire for attempts to cure epilepsy/madness, also was known as the sacred disease because it was believed that it was sent by gods. And so they would try to cure that disease by purification. The main argument of this tractate, of this pamphlet, was that if a disease comes from gods, then only remedy is prayer, sacrifice, and supplication. And purification then is the most impious and godless thing to do. But then Hippocrates proceeds to comment on theology behind these views. And this is, I find, the most fascinating statement among Greek theology, and perhaps among Greek theologians. And so he says, and I quote, "Either truly I do count it a worthy opinion to hold that the body of man is polluted by God, the most impure by most holy. For were it defiled, or did it suffer from any other thing, it would be like to be purified and sanctified rather than polluted by God. For it is the divinity which purifies and sanctifies the greatest of offenses and the most wicked." The end of quote. The statement is fascinating if put in the context of the Gospels. Jesus, the Son of God, does exactly that. He purifies and sanctifies people around him, despite the claims that he is possessed by unclean spirits. I would imagine Jesus would also agree with Hippocrates on this, that epilepsy and madness is not of divine origin. The Gospels connect those symptoms with the presence of evil or unclean spirits. And Jesus, the Holy One of God, expels them and restores person's purity, brings healing. And of course, as in those stories, the person who was affected comes to his mind, returns to his mind. That's fascinating. And healing in the Gospels is also connected with purity. But as we can see, Jesus never uses purification techniques, apart maybe from using saliva and a mud mixture. That could be seen as a purification substance. But Jesus heals and purifies just by simple touch or the word of power. Okay, let's move on to unclean spirits. Greeks and Romans believed in the existence of evil and unclean spirits, and even deities who range from being mischievous and perhaps harmless to be very dangerous and harmful. Our God-fearer was particularly scared of Hecate, and for a good reason. As the goddess of underworld, she was connected with death and every form of pollution. There is an invocation preserved by Plutarch, and it's very telling. And I quote that invocation of Hecate: "Whether you have come hastening from a hanging, or from grinding to death a woman in childbirth, or from raging among corpses, polluted you enter the holy shrine." Goddess, polluted? Well, her presence spells trouble. Her harmful powers and ability to pollute were used in harmful magic. In order to cast out the goddess from a place, an officiant would have to gather few means for purification: salt, laurel, a puppy, a dog puppy as to sacrifice, asphalt, and a torch. A side note for my American friends, the Statue of Liberty, it seems, has Hecate's iconography behind it. A spiky crown, a torch, that's Hecate. But anyway, moving on. Unclean spirits were also connected to diseases as well. Daimons were divine agents of pollution, impure spirits acting as agents of divine vengeance, and to them purification rites were addressed. And of course, these Greek readers of the Gospels could project that notions of unclean spirits on exorcism stories and Jesus' interaction with those daimons. But of course, in daimons, of course, then it turns into demons in a Christian angelology or demonology. But for Greeks, they didn't have that original kind of a very evil or connected to Satan or anything like that. But still, they had that notion of being sometimes agents of pollution. But often, unclean spirits were associated with vengeful spirits of the dead. If a person was violently murdered, or perhaps a corpse wasn't properly buried, their spirits would turn into angry engines of pollution. They should be appeased and purified. In the light of this belief, perhaps, the legion of unclean spirits in Mark 5 could be seen as a band of spirits of Roman soldiers who were violently murdered on the battlefield or executed as prisoners of war. Is there a legend of a lost legion somewhere among Roman sources? Could it be one of the legions of Marcus Licinius Crassus, who was defeated by Parthians somewhere in Syria in the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE? And now this band of the soldiers are roaming Syrian desert. Or maybe it's one of the three of Augustus' legions who were lost by Varus at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE. Well, further investigation is needed. Okay, moving on to unclean food. I'm finishing soon, I hope. Unclean food would have inner purity. Okay, yeah, okay. Unclean food. For Greeks, food could be no less polluting than human bones. Imbachilus, the Neoplatonist philosopher, records a story about Pythagoreans who choose to die from the hands of their pursuers rather than to cross a field of broad beans in blossom, thus exemplifying complete dedication to the mandates of their sect. Compare that to martyrdom of Eleazar, a Jewish priest who refused not to eat the sacrificial pork, defying the king's Antiochus command. Well, the Jews were not the only people in the Mediterranean basin who had the notion of unclean food and were prepared to die for it. Some scholars suggest that the practice came to Greeks from the East. Nonetheless, it was widely accepted. Pythagorean left us the following instructions, and I quote, "Purification is by cleansing, baptism and discretion, and by keeping clean from all deaths and births and all pollution, and abstaining from meat and fish of animals that have died, mullets, gurnards, egg-sprung animals, beans, and the other abstinences prescribed by those who perform mystic rites in the temples." Some of them went even further, end of quote. Some of them went even further, declaring certain parts of eatable animals unclean: kidneys, testicles, genitals, marrow, feet, and heads, and even hearts were unclean. Similar food taboos existed among the followers of the Orphic mysteries, where purity was maintained by abstaining from eggs, beans, and, surprisingly for Greeks, wine. Crazy. For Pythagorean, Orphic and Bacchic movements, abstention from unclean foodstuffs was the way of living, like for the Pharisees in Judaism. But for those extreme attitudes, were not shared by all. Other Greek religious traditions only practiced abstention from unclean foodstuff just before visiting sacred space or participating in cultic rituals. A cathartic law from the temple of Asclepius at Pergamon reads, and I quote, "He who enters the dormitory must be pure from all things mentioned above, and from sex, and from goat meat, and from goat cheese." Adelos, devotees of Atargis, abstained from fish for several days before participating in sacred banquets. Well, here the gospel traditions and early church debates over unclean food fit very well. Jesus' proclamation of all food clean in Mark 7, of course, radically redefines all those widespread notions that is connected with unclean food and divine presence and worship and so on and so forth. But also in Pauline corpus, in the early Pauline churches, sacred sacrifices of Gentiles was seen as unclean by early Christians and Jews alike. So purity, but also kind of a diversity, is almost a sacrilegious way. Okay, let's move on quickly to inner purity. Recent studies of purity in the ancient world and the Bible make it quite obvious that so-called ritual purity and the notion of inner purity are more interrelated in the ancient religions and cultures than we allowed them to be in the past. They're not mutually excluding concepts, as they share vocabulary and both play an important role in cultic worship. Examples could be found in both in Greece and Rome. The worshippers of Asclepius at Epidaurus were instructed, "Pure must be the person who goes inside the sweet-smelling temple. Purity is to think holy thoughts." Similar inscriptions were found at Asclepian temples in Mytilene and Rhodes. This maxim could give an impression that purity of hands or ritual purity has been replaced by purity of heart. In reality, the temple in Epidaurus was surrounded by basins for ritual purification, and worshippers were required to wash their hands before entering. The requirement of pure heart does not actually dispose rites of purification, but extends purity demands to the inner core of human body and personality. Asclepius was not the only god who required both purity of hands and purity of heart for appropriate worship. Apollo, Zeus, and the Great Mother were equally demanding. Cicero's take on the issue in the Legibus eloquently summarizes this ancient attitude, and I quote, "The law orders people to approach the gods in purity of mind, of course, in which everything else resides. It doesn't exclude physical purity, but it should be understood how much the mind is superior to the body. Purity of body should be respected in approaching the gods, but it is all the more important to preserve that of the mind. Physical impurity can be removed by a splash of water or the lapse of a fixed number of days, but a stain on the mind does not fade with time, nor can it be washed out by any river." The end of quote. Andrei and Ivana Petrovich are doing very impressive work on the inner purity in Greek religion. And if you're interested in something like that, I recommend their books. Inner purity in Greek tradition is intrinsically connected with morality. So their research shows that evidently such virtues as honesty, loyalty, faithfulness, selflessness, justice, righteousness, and sexual decorum are praised. Impurity, on the other hand, comes from dishonesty, perjury, unfaithfulness, scheming and plotting, selfishness, undermining interests of community, and inappropriate sexual desires. Inner attitudes become sinful even before action occurs. Even inappropriate thinking about ritual, gods, and social norms constitute inner pollution. For them, the difference between intention and execution of transgression are almost indivisible. This is, of course, not very far from Jesus' views. But also, it is evident from Petrovich's research that morality, worship, and purity are integral part of non-monotheistic religions of the time. And of course, Jesus raises the issue of inner purity in debates with the Pharisees, and often it's not connected with temple worship, but extends this concern into the everyday life context. If you said the list of Jesus' list of things that cause inner pollution in Mark 7 and Greek transgressions, you will see that they would overlap. But of course, there will be some differences as well. But that requires further exploration. And of course, a lot of similarities could be found in Pauline tradition rather than in Jesus' one. Even on the level of language, while Jesus uses language of cardia to talk about inner purity, the language of heart, of pure heart, Greeks would prefer to use mind, nous, or soul, psyche, or thoughts, gnome. And of course, that's very much corresponds with Pauline corpus rather than Jesus corpus. And of course, the early Christian emphasis on inner purity is perhaps connected with the notion of divine presence within believers and reimagining worship and ritual around that idea. Greeks also believe that in maintenance of inner purity by self-control and reflection upon one's transgressions. But of course, the complete purity comes from the gods. There is a prayer to Apollo. Apollo, cleanse my mind and my soul, which is of course quite interesting if we compare it to modern evangelical prayers of sinner's prayer. But anyway, but also in terms of comparing it to early Christianity, of course, we also see that it's a work of the Holy Spirit that purifies inner self. And it's not only about self-control, that the language of self-control exists, but also it's an ongoing work of divine grace that marks out a Christian approach to inner purity. Okay, final paragraph. I'll skip a few things and just a final paragraph. So this is kind of a big map. I didn't go into detail. I had to cut out a few thousand words for this presentation. But you can see that purity concerns and anxieties shape almost all aspects of ancient life and create meaningful background for Jesus' life and ministry. And of course, there are many issues to explore in detail, but at this point, I just want to offer one preliminary observation. In the time where human bodies were seen as sources of uncleanliness and hindrances to divinely established order of things, the Christ event disrupted that logic and redefined the notion of divine presence and self. Birth impurity is purified by incarnation. Death impurity is sanctified by resurrection. God in Christ does not shy away from uncleanliness as pagan gods do, and transforms it. That is why later Christian priests baptized babies and conducted funeral services, while pagan priests would have to abstain from the house of birth and the house of death. The priests not only signal God's presence at the key junctions of human life and demonstrate divine grace, but also highlight the value of individual bodily life in the eyes of God, as opposed to seeing as a hindrance in the pagan religions. The fully human and divine one also shatters the everyday patterns of pollution and cleanliness. He welcomes those who threaten human and divine order by their pollution. He removes social labels associated with impurity. He bridges invisible yet tangible boundaries by touching the unclean. He restores their dignity. He purifies. And by doing so, he confronts religious elites' obsession with pollution and overwhelming prejudice of the masses. In his ministry, the purity logic of separation, abstention, and removal gives way to the logic of presence, hospitality, and solidarity. Jesus offers a new way of harmony between human and divine that is based on love, justice, and mercy. Maybe there is a lesson for us in the wake of coronavirus outbreak. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's great, Arseny. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions, not many, but if anybody has a question, then please feel free to get started on that. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, Arseny. Love this, love talking to you about this in times past. This is really good stuff. Here's a question. Years ago, there was a book called None of Your Diseases. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It was a fairly popular book about talking about why all the food rules and purification regulations were there in ancient Judaism. And the idea was that they emerged out of things like preventing the spread of disease and so on. And so you would not eat, you wouldn't have a dead body in your midst because it did spread disease. And so it becomes almost ritualized into a purity religious thing that was there essentially practically. And many of the rules that were there in the ancient world seem to go out of this practicality. Is that the case in the Greco-Roman world that you found as well? Or is that not how it goes there, do you think?
That's a good question. I think it's probably still debated. What are the reasons for purity rules? Are they grounded just in a kind of in a very? But I just find that this is a very modern explanation, and it stems out of our understanding of physical world and our worldview. So we're trying to. I think we just project our worldview into the ancient world, trying to explain it. The ancients wouldn't explain it that way at all, I'm afraid. For them, yes, diseases are connected with impurity. But for example, we talk about, let's go back to Judaism, for example. We talk about leprosy. The word for leprosy is the same word that there's something on your skin, but also the spots on the wall of your house. So what's happening here? Is it coming out of disease? No, it's hard to tell. So then how those, if it's a physical disease, how they affect the gods? Because the main concern is actually the gods, not the people for Greeks. Is that the impurity is not going into the temple and sanctuaries, that the sanctuaries stay clean. So how does it, yes, perhaps there is a logic to that. They understood that some of the diseases perhaps could spread by touch. but it's not the main concern. Or, for example, you take the practices of Qumran, they would wash themselves in the water that is dirty. I mean, for our standards, but for them, it's not the concern. So yeah, there is something to it, but it's not the way ancients would explain it. And in fact, if you wanted to understand them on their own terms, I think kind of yeah, I'm not particularly convinced that that's how it worked.
Yeah, the argument that was made in this book was that the gods gave this to the people for their own protection. That was the argument that was being made. So they took it as...
I see. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
No.
Just
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thanks, Arseny. You mentioned at the end the elite and the masses. How do you relate purity to social relations between the elite and the masses? Is it something that is shared, or is it more of a elite concern about the poor polluting everyone?
That's a great question. I think because purity plays a crucial role for negotiating social interactions and stuff. Yeah, it's one of the mechanisms of social interaction and kind of now I'm losing English words, structuring society. But when you talk about elites, normally elites would be suspicious of these things. So they would comment on what masses are practicing or what they believe in, and they were like with a distaste. Though they would recognize the importance of purity, but they were kind of look, they're just, some of them are just nuts. They're taking it to a much extreme. Because we are philosophers, we are reasonable men, and so we need to be reasonable citizens. And so some of those practices were seen as unreasonable. For example, if you read how they write about Egyptians or Mesopotamians, or even the Jews, they treat their attitudes to impurity as superstitious and not reasonable. And so that seems to be a main kind of argument, that you need to be reasonable in the matters of religion and in the matters of purity. But look at those masses, they are a bit crazy or going crazy. We need to bring them some sort of a back. But of course, they would never undermine the importance of purity. But also, I think everybody is unclean, but some more unclean than others. And so, for example, if there is a pater familia died in the household, it's one thing. And if it's for example, child died, child doesn't even pollute, but pater familia pollutes you to complete. Or if a slave girl died, she wouldn't even pollute to the same extent that is a pater familia. So there's an interesting dynamics, even the levels of impurity. But what the problem we have, and going back to the sources, all of our sources come from the elite and their take on the issues of purity. And sometimes it's hard to get to what was practiced and believed on kind of a folk level. And it's important because particularly for the Gospels, I suppose, because Jesus engages with, of course, with the religious elites, but also with common people. And so that's, I think, quite an interesting thing, an important thing. And of course, discern intentions behind those documents, those sources that we receive, and talk about purity is quite important as well, I suppose. And what are they trying to achieve, and what kind of eternal conversations they're having within their culture. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, but anyway.
I think it's interesting. I love what you said about the fact that birth in purity was changed by the incarnation, and that death in purity by the resurrection. I just think when theology sort of meets the church, it's not that long since a churching of women's service was held, for women after childbirth in the Church of England. It's part of the Book of Common Prayer. So not that long ago that sort of impurity idea, going back to Leviticus, was what determined the use of that service, I think, rather than that sense that our theology of Christ's incarnation, bringing purity. Rendering that service unnecessary. I don't know. I don't know whether they still hold it, but it's recent. Still strong sense of impurity for me.
Yeah, but for example, the Christian tradition of burying saints in the churches, that's anathema to the Greeks and religious. Of course, you can probably put a hero's grave somewhere in the public space because a hero or a semi-god or something that's totally relatable. But putting a corpse in the sanctuary, even below altar, sometimes this is just nonsense. This is something. This is a shift. Christian theology brings a huge shift in that area, and so of course I would love to see birth. Yeah. We need to think through a lot of this. We need to think through theologically, but I think those readings oppose against Greco-Roman background, kind of oppose those, I think, interesting questions and makes us think what Jesus does with that. Anyway.
I have a question here from one of our online viewers, Joe Brennan. He's asking, can you comment on purity and gender equality in the new creation, especially with relation to marital submission in Ephesians 5 and Colossians 3? And as a side note, he'll never look at the Statue of Liberty the same way again.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, so you see this, the Lady Liberty is actually a goddess from the Hades, but anyway, no. Yes, purity of the body, and this is a good question, and I think I didn't have time to think about it through, but I think the resurrection does something to the body, and impurity that is connected to it. Is the final purification, final sanctification? I just don't know. I think I need to talk to theologians to think that through, and of course, those references he brings, they comes from Colossians and others. So there's a Pauline scholars to talk to. I'm like a more Jesus man. I love Jesus, not so much Paul. But yes, I think there is something to it. And gender equality and of course you want to talk to Jesus, then you're going to be like angels and. Yes, I need to think that through. I just didn't have time to, but that's a good question to think about. What resurrection does to death and death impurity. I'm open to those I suppose. Sorry, couldn't be helpful.
One last question.
Well, that's one. Thank you for your mapping. Very helpful. I was fascinated by the triad of birth, sex, and death. And that those three often appear together. The birth, I totally get, right? Bloodshed, you get that. Death, you totally understand too. Sex is a bit of an odd one in the three. And as you said so at the end, you both have Jesus sanctifying birth by the incarnation and sanctifying death by the resurrection. Is there anything apart from Ephesians 5, where I think Paul might just continue that kind of line of thinking? Is there anything in the Gospels where you could say, Jesus also sanctifies the impurity of sex as a single man? Yeah, is there three that addressed in the Gospels, or is sex still impure if we only have the Gospels?
Well, absolutely, that's a great question. Actually, it's unfortunate that there's not that much sex in the Gospels, I suppose. But or when it appears, it's quite in the negative ways, and even Mary. Anyway, Joseph, I think, is probably being more disappointed. But yes, I think there is something. Of course, you can argue maybe along the lines. It doesn't help because virginity seems to be praised, and praised later in Christian tradition and so on and so forth. There's a pure sexual purity of some sort, and this kind of a myth of virginity as a very important one. In terms of sex, I think probably Greeks and Romans had a more kind of maybe relaxed attitude towards sex than Jews, and maybe that's because the Jewish background of the gospel is so strong. Even they wouldn't mind. Well, even so, for example, you talk about having sex with somebody's partner, and what's the penalty for it? Well, instead of 1 day waiting before going to temple, you just wait 2 days. Okay, well, fair enough, I suppose. Yeah, so to think about, and maybe you're right, maybe it's going beyond the Gospels, maybe in a wider canon, maybe going to Paul, that was taken further. But even in Paul, it seems that abstention, or yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's hard for me to think about it, but yeah, I need to think about it. If we had only Gospels, what about sex? Is there impurity of sex? Well, Jesus, because of course the impurity that's connected in the Gospel is connected to adultery. So that's clearly, Jesus mentions that as impurity that comes within. So what's the opposite to that? Sex and marriage? Well, for Jesus, I don't know.
Maybe the allowance for remarriage, that might be one of the few ways in, right?
Yeah, but that's a great question. That's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. You've stimulated a lot of conversation, and I'm sure we could have gone on asking questions for some time. But really appreciate your contribution today, so thank you. Let's show our appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's unfortunate that I don't have time, but I had some great stuff on the power of blood. Well, it was menstrual blood, but anyway, but that was a great stuff. I had to cut it out. I had a great stuff on the month of February. Had to cut it out, but maybe for another time. Why February was called February, but actually it was month of purification. It's a month of purification. Anyway, doesn't matter. I will see you at some point. You enjoy your day, and I'll try to enjoy my bed.
Thank you. Still
Just to
speaking
say,
English, it's amazing.
next week it's John Darby
Yes.
singing in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, thank you very much for coming on us.
Bye. See you later.